There is a question that nobody covering the 2026 Miami Open wanted to ask out loud, because asking it out loud meant admitting something deeply uncomfortable about the sport they love. The question was not about who won the championship. It was not about the scoreline or the tactics or the head-to-head record. The question was simpler and more damaging than any of those things. And it went like this. How did a final between two of the biggest names in women's tennis feel like a quieter event than a second-round match played 10 days earlier? How did Aryna Sabalenka, the world number one, the defending champion, the player who had just swept Indian Wells and Miami to complete one of the rarest achievements in modern tennis, walk onto a full stadium court and somehow feel like the energy in that building had already peaked without her? And why, before the trophy was even handed out, were tennis fans across every platform asking the same blunt question: did Miami actually end when Eala left? Let that sit for a moment, because that question is not comfortable for the WTA. It is not comfortable for tournament organizers. It is not comfortable for broadcasters who spent weeks carefully building a narrative around the Sabalenka and Gauff showdown that was supposed to close out the hardcourt swing in style. But it is the question that the 2026 Miami Open left behind once the courts were packed up and the players flew home. And the answer, when you follow the evidence honestly, reveals something about modern tennis that a rankings spreadsheet will never capture. To understand how the final became the second most talked about story of its own tournament, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment Eala walked onto a grandstand court in the opening rounds, and the Filipino flags went up, and the noise changed, and everyone in the building quietly registered that something different was happening. She arrived as the 31st seed, ranked 29th in the world, carrying the weight of being the most culturally significant player in the draw, who was not named Sabalenka. She was not the headline. She was not supposed to be the story. She was seated respectably, expected to go a few rounds, validate her ranking, and hand the narrative back to the established elite. Instead, she became the tournament, not officially, not in any way the bracket recognized, but in every way that actually matters to the experience of being inside a major sports event. From her first match, something unusual started happening. Crowds were not just watching her play. They were showing up early for her matches specifically. They were staying in their seats long after the final point, not rushing to the exits or the concession stands, but lingering in the way people linger when they have witnessed something they want to hold on to for another few seconds. Clips of her matches were circulating across social media in a way that earlier round WTA results almost never do. Fans who had never followed women's tennis closely suddenly had a reason to check the order of play every single morning. Not because of her seeding or her ranking, but because of something that cannot be manufactured and cannot be scheduled: genuine connection. The Filipino diaspora in Miami and across South Florida made their presence impossible to ignore from the opening days. They had flown in from cities across the United States, from the Philippines, from across the region. They brought flags. They brought jerseys. They brought a level of devotion that one broadcast analyst described perfectly in real time, noting that whenever you see players from smaller countries finally break through, the fans are so passionate in a way that the traditional tennis audience simply does not replicate. That observation was accurate, and it also understated what was actually happening, because the Eala fans in Miami were not just passionate. They were organized. They were planning their entire weeks around her match schedule. Dinners built around when she was playing, evenings structured around the order of play, gatherings arranged so that people who could not be in the building could at least watch together. One commentator heard about this, and his reaction was genuine disbelief, asking whether there were actual organized gatherings happening. And when the answer came back, yes, absolutely, he responded that he had never heard of another player outside of someone's immediate family having dinners planned around a single tennis match. He said it simply: that is real tennis fandom right there. That is what you cannot buy. And that fandom showed up in the building in ways that changed the experience of attending those early rounds. The energy shifted from the polite applause that lower round WTA matches usually produce into something closer to a home crowd atmosphere, even in a city known for divided loyalties and a fan base that historically needs to be earned rather than assumed. her highlights were consistently outperforming matches featuring more established names in terms of social media reach and engagement. Broadcasters adjusted their tone when discussing her matches. Commentators who had started the week with measured observations about a promising 20-year-old were by the middle of the week talking about her spirit, her fight, the way she refused to let matches slip away, the way she had the crowd in the palm of her hand even when the score was not in her favor. One analyst described watching her battle through a close match with leg tape visible, grinding through exchanges against a seasoned opponent, and noted that the fight she showed was the kind of thing you were going to keep seeing for years to come if she maintained this momentum. Another broadcaster admitted on air that there had been multiple moments during a single match where the entire commentary team had gotten up from their chairs, genuinely convinced the match was slipping away, only to watch her drag it back. People were not showing up because they were told to. They were showing up because they wanted to. And that difference is everything in sports. It is the difference between attention that is scheduled and attention that is earned. It is the difference between a match that is important on paper and a match that feels important in the moment, in the body, in the stomach, in the way you cannot look at your phone for 3 minutes because something real might happen while you are not watching. As long as Eala was in the tournament, Miami felt alive in that specific way. Every round she advanced made the event louder and less predictable. Fans who had no prior investment in women's tennis were suddenly invested. And then she was gone. She lost in the 4th round to Karolina Muchova 6-0, 6-2 in an hour. It was a clinical, efficient, completely decisive defeat against a player who knew exactly where to attack and executed the plan without hesitation. Eala was honest about it afterward. She did not dress it up. She took the loss on the chin with the composure of someone who understood it as information rather than catastrophe. And she left Miami with $105,120 in prize money, a ranking drop from 29 to 45, and a 0-13 record against Czech players that stubbornly refused to change. The moment she left, the tournament felt different. The word that kept surfacing in post-match discussions, in fan reactions, in the quieter conversations happening in press areas and broadcast booths was this one: quieter, not empty, not a failure, quieter. The buzz that had dominated social media conversations about the Miami Open for 10 days shifted into something more routine, more predictable, more like what a WTA 1000 tennis tournament usually sounds like when it is running exactly as designed. The matches were still elite. The players still delivered. The semifinal between Sabalenka and Rybakina was by any objective measure a historically significant contest, the first time the world number 1 and number 2 had met at a semifinal stage outside the WTA finals since 1998. It should have consumed the tennis conversation entirely. It was enormous news, and it competed in the social media ecosystem with the ongoing discussion of whether Alex Eala was going to fix her serve in time for the clay season. That is not a trivial observation. That is the entire story. On paper, the final should have been untouchable. You had Aryna Sabalenka, the most dominant power hitter in the game right now, having dropped 0 sets across her entire run to the championship, having beaten Ann Lee, Caddy McNally, Zheng Qinwen, Haley Baptiste, and Elena Rybakina without being taken to a 3rd set once. And you had Coco Gauff, the player who had been marketed as the future of the game for years and who had spent the previous 2 weeks proving she deserved that designation, grinding through 4 3-set matches while managing a forearm issue she had carried from Indian Wells, then absolutely dominating Muchova 6-1, 6-1 in the semifinals, 2 genuine champions, a head-to-head tied at 6, all entering the match, a 6th seed hometown favorite chasing her 12th career title at the one tournament she had always wanted most, a world number 1 chasing the Sunshine Double that only 4 women before her had ever completed. The drama was built in, the stakes were real, the match was legitimate, and broadcasters openly noted before a ball was struck that something was missing. Not in those exact words, but in the way the pre-final coverage kept finding reasons to talk about the earlier rounds. The way Eala's name kept surfacing in analysis that was nominally about the finalists. the way the question of who had actually captured Miami's imagination during the previous 2 weeks kept threading itself through conversations that were supposed to be focused entirely on Saturday's championship match. One analyst previewing the final acknowledged that Gauff and Sabalenka were defending significant ranking points going into the clay season, and that the stakes for both players were enormous from a positioning standpoint. All of that was accurate, and it was also somehow less electric than watching a 20-year-old from Quezon City argue with a chair umpire about the shot clock. That is the gap. That is what the 2026 Miami Open exposed with uncomfortable clarity, the gap between institutional importance and organic magnetism. Between a match that is significant on every quantifiable level and a player whose presence makes people feel something that significance alone cannot produce. Eala was described by fans and broadcasters alike, using language that rarely gets applied to someone ranked outside the top 25. People compared her to Manny Pacquiao in terms of what she represented to national identity. They talked about her wisdom at 20 years old, the way she was already thinking about the future of tennis beyond her own career, the way she carried the Filipino flag not as a prop, but as a genuine weight she understood and accepted. They talked about how she spent time with fans after every match, signing autographs and taking photos and making people feel seen in a way that elite athletes do not always prioritize. And then she went home to prepare for clay, and Miami went quiet in the specific frequency that she had been generating. Sabalenka won the final 6-2, 4-6, 6-3. She was, by every honest assessment, the better player on Saturday. Gauff pushed her in the second set and gave herself a foothold in the third before Sabalenka closed it out with the kind of controlled aggression that had defined her entire fortnight. Sabalenka became only the 5th woman in the Open era to complete the Sunshine Double. She did something historic. She deserved every dollar of the championship prize money. And in her post-match comments, she acknowledged something that hinted at the complexity of the week she had just navigated. She noted that she had played really tough matches against really incredible opponents across the 2 weeks, and that she had played better tennis in those earlier rounds than she had in the final. She called it honestly the worst tennis she had played in a very long time. She said the conditions were difficult and that Gauff had simply handled those conditions better than she did in certain moments. That honesty is one of the things that makes Sabalenka compelling, even in victory. She does not dress things up. She tells the truth about her own performance with a directness that is rare at this level. And what she told the truth about, inadvertently, was that the final had not been the peak of her tournament either. The peak had come earlier, in the moments where she was playing the best tennis of the fortnight, against opponents who pushed her in ways the final ultimately did not. The tournament's best tennis and the tournament's most electric atmosphere had both arrived before the championship day. And that is an uncomfortable reality for an organization that structures its entire product around the assumption that the final is always the climax. What the WTA is reckoning with now, in the aftermath of Miami, is the same thing it has been reckoning with since Eala made the semifinals as a wild card in 2025, and the stands filled in ways that a 140th ranked player had no business filling. The organization has a player who does something to crowds that cannot be engineered. It has a player who generated more social media engagement per match than players ranked 30 positions above her. It has a player whose post-match press conference live stream at the Australian Open earlier this year drew over 100,000 viewers, surpassing Sabalenka and Carlos Alcaraz on the same day. It has a player whose departure from a tournament's draw is itself a talking point, and the structural question that keeps getting deferred is the one that ultimately matters. What does a sport do when its most magnetic presence is not its most decorated champion? The answer requires more than good intentions. It requires scheduling intelligence that matches court assignments and session slots to documented fan demand rather than to seeding order alone. It requires a ranking system that does not punish breakthrough players disproportionately when one extraordinary week expires after 52 weeks and they have nothing else to cushion the fall. It requires fan education infrastructure that meets new communities where they are, the millions of people across the Philippines and the Filipino diaspora who came to tennis through Eala and are still learning what the sport expects of them in the stands. It requires an organization willing to recognize momentum while it is actually happening, not in the retrospective analysis of why the energy felt different after the quarterfinals than it did during the second round.